Hello everyone, today we talk about the 14th century crisis, one of the most important chapters in medieval history, probably overlooked, even though historiographically speaking now we have a pretty wide spread consensus about the massive amount of change that this we can't say, because the problem is the causes at all times. Like, historians generally agree on facts. The problem is rather their interpretation. So today we will see essentially, in part, what we think triggered this transformation, but always knowing that the causes are fundamentally unknown in their measure, in their effective measure, right? There could be, maybe it was the wars, maybe it was the just production failing, we don't know what happened, maybe it was demographic, maybe it was climatic, probably was all about all of these things together. But the important thing here is really the change in itself and the dramatic character of the same, right? This is probably one of the single most important, and I say it's overlooked because I think, historians do know about these things, medievalists do know about that, we study that, but at the same, I'm absolutely no expert about it by any standard, but generally speaking, we don't think of a Middle Ages that entered in crisis towards the end. Like, we think more like the Middle Ages was a dark flatland, right? And that all of a sudden Renaissance popped out, and that's it. And of course, this doesn't even make sense by itself, because things do not emerge out of nothing. There are always certain bases out of that, but it's really the consequences of this change that have major impact in our history, even up to very recent times. I mean, what we call, for example, the Ancien Régime, that ended, let's say, between, depending on what you want to count it, between the French Revolution and the First World War, fundamentally. It's something, in fact, very recent, right? And much of its bases were effectively set at this point, right? And crystallized and consolidated. Right, in the 13th century, this was not so evident. Like, there were, of course, the roots of the same, but this political and social adjustment to structuration that effectively was, fruitful, because this civilization didn't collapse. Right, it's not like the ancient world that fundamentally disappears at a certain point because it transmutes at least into something else, because it contracts, it declines. There is a major crisis in the 14th century. But fundamentally, the system is able to absorb this impact and to actually go on and keep growing immediately. And this is very fascinating and thought-provoking, also because when you read the sources from the same time, you actually don't see much of a rationalization and objectivization of this change. I mean, you get all the information for which we effectively know, and not only that, this thing happened, but also that they realized this thing happened, because it's them who told us, literally, and that's what largely we can rely on at the time. Like, archaeology is important. We can find a lot of things, but essentially, documentary sources and even chronicles are of enormous importance. These are dramatically underestimated sources, especially in certain national historiographies, because they say, the chronicle is unreliable. This is absolutely wrong, especially in certain areas of Europe that incidentally were the most advanced and that also suffered a major blow in that moment. We actually get a unanimous, uniform, compact, reliable picture of a system that entered in crisis. There is a major characteristics of the same, like, we are living now in the crisis. Like, if you had told children that went to school, I don't know, a few decades ago, that what the crisis was, it would have not been so evident. Like, in the 70s we had the oil crisis with the word, there was this realization that not everything was 100% okay. Even in the 80s there were major problems economically speaking here in the West, but the concept is that we were growing, right? Instead, and in our view of crisis today is essentially a worsening of those conditions we used to live in before. At the time, it's a bit of a different thing. At the time, there is more like the sense that a system that had kept growing basically slows down, it stalls, right? It enters sometimes even in a recession, but at the same time there is not this enormous evidence that the system in fact began to go under, negative in overall as a system. Like demographically, yes, today we don't talk about the Black Death, but it's obvious that that was a major blow, etc. But as we were saying before, this thing kept floating, right? The European civilization kept going on. Also, the others actually did pretty well, as far as we understand. And this poses also a lot of other problems in our understanding of epidemics. Even think about the Justinian pandemics and how that affect, how debated it is. That there are scholars now that are coming out with the idea that fundamentally wasn't, maybe it was overestimated. In my opinion, it wasn't overestimated, but there is an enormous methodological problem on how to find out this thing. It's like even those researchers about pollen, I don't know, in fact in 6th century Turkey or Greece, and that allegedly that should prove like that maybe we would have a clear picture of what the economy or the demographic was really at the time. Well, in my opinion, heuristically speaking, I don't think that these researches make. I mean, they're useful in some measure, but I'm not sure up to which point. It's just having fun with new methods that can be very useful, and there is nothing bad with that. But with actual, in achieving an actual real and a realistic picture of what was happening at the time. And about the 14th century, we obviously know way more, right? It's self-evident. But even in here, as we were saying before, we don't know much about the causes, right? And historiographies get fixated sometimes with certain interpretations because maybe initially they're innovative, and therefore everybody wants to sound smart and repeating that. But after a while, you realize that maybe that was overestimated. Think about climate change. Climate change has always been dramatically important. Historically speaking, we know it. Climate does change. Even if Earth wasn't inhabited by mankind, we probably add to that. But think about astronomical cycles. Think like this. There were certain parts in the Arctic that were tropical at one point. The magnets bounce. The poles move. All these things that, of course, in the last 1,000 years at this point haven't changed dramatically, but still were important in impacting the environment, especially considering that these were much more fragile economical systems than our own, and they were largely based on agriculture, which naturally is affected by such changes. And in fact, when you study this period, the whole thing revolves around the harvest. What was the harvest that season? And that's in fact what the chronicles are concerned with, because these guys didn't rationalize. They didn't have graphs. They didn't have this capacity of abstracting. They simply calculated things because they more or less knew. Like, we don't even know how many people actually lived in Europe at this point. Maybe in a city there was a very well organized one. They knew they had this number of population roughly, but it wasn't not even important in order to run the system to know these things, right? And this is part of the reason why naturally even the system was, more exposed to this collapse, let's say. But at the same time, it was run for time standards. They ran it pretty well because they knew much more about it than we do now. And we observed that there is a logic in these transformations that is actually pretty clear and against which you couldn't really do much, right? But even for climate change, I was talking about before, the most sophisticated historiography today comes to say things like, maybe climate did have an impact. It surely had, actually. We're pretty certain about it. A significant change, but what if, expansion was dictated simply by the fact that humans tend to reproduce, to work, and to better their living conditions, and therefore they expand naturally by it, right? We can look at medieval growth and expansion, especially growth, as a result of this initial contraction at the beginning, and independently from from climate change, which probably, I personally think it did have an important role, especially in certain cases. In my opinion, it's fairly evident that that humans simply didn't expand in Europe because they had land available for doing that, and this was a ferocious expansion, by the way. That in certain cases, and that's why I believe actually that climate change had an impact in this regard, because we also tend to give a sort of progressive idea to the growth in itself. Like, this is a prejudice we have fundamentally from positivism in the mid 19th century, that everything that grows is fine. Like, our societies must just continue growing and growing and growing. Then how that is managed doesn't quite care, as long as you always advance. There are certain moments, historically speaking, where things have to be stabilized in a way or another. Most of the times they get stabilized by themselves. Other times, however, this happens through major cracks, major breaks, let's say, and very often this is catastrophic because this is systemic, right? And this is roughly what happened in the 14th century, also starting from the very last decades of the 13th, right? When this system that had expanded for whichever reason at one point is not able to sustain itself anymore, right? And this all happened very gradually, right? And we don't know exactly the measures, the proportions, right? All we know is the 14th century is effectively a century of break for many reasons. And the paradox in here stands mostly in the fact that the 14th century is still a pretty florid one, right? The Black Death is also very, evocative. This thing of, the plague that killed lots of people. Probably numbers have been overestimated at that point as well. It's not likely that an actual third of the population died on that occasion. That we know it would have a very high mortality as a disease, and it spread far and wide. But also we can't attribute to that the whole. Was it, for example, a cause and a consequence? This is being wondered as well. Did the plague spread because there was an already messed up, for example, society where poverty and lack of hygiene, etc., and overcrowding, especially in the cities, that had occurred. We know had occurred from previous centuries, had favored the conditions of the disease spread on a population that was already quite exposed to illnesses because of poor defense, immune defense, and the concept here is, however, realizing there was also still a lot of wealth around. The 14th century is a great moment of innovation as well, and this is typical, however, of moments of crisis, because until you don't have problems, fundamentally you don't need to invest much resources in solving them, do you? That's normally what happens, is that great systems that expand after great work, great difficulties and struggles, etc., at one point they tend to relax, right? And this is where effectively something at one point breaks down, because it comes to to miss the basis to sustain itself. There are also dramatically striking analogies between what happens today. I think this is something I said since last year, even the year before, right? That we live in a pretty similar time to that one, right? And this is not just because of coronavirus. That's the easy comparison. It's really a much broader structural phenomenon. It's a socio-economical dynamic. Also, culturally speaking, I think we're pretty close to those times. There have been, maybe later we can make better comparison in this regard. Naturally, we can't force it, we can't stress it, but these are kind of cycles that people think that cycles just repeat over and over again, like with a similar pattern, right? The mistake is not much believing in the existence of these cycles, which naturally are a conceptual approximation to understand what happens, but rather on the fact that they represent themselves with the same pattern. Like, you can't have something similar, but the pattern of which is framed in a completely different context, right? So, always being careful also at making comparisons, but at the same time realizing that humans are always the same, right? So even if we can adapt dramatically faster to certain situations, there is to say that objectively we seem to function. It's really about the economics of physics, right? We tend psychophysically to respond in similar ways in certain situations, and that have nothing to do eventually how with behavior, culturally influenced, and lots of other things. That's why you can't generalize, but still, this is important to understand even the failures of these of societies in general. Where is that at one point a system saturates, and why is that people in large masses especially are, albeit not predictable, also however still predictably exposed to mistakes and to certain kind of common responses that at one point, I mean, on the base of the moment of the contingental data, you are able to say, probably this thing will happen, right? But we can't guess all the other things that can happen in the meanwhile, right? And there are lots of things we keep underestimating, as these days are proving in some ways. But to maybe contextualize better what we're talking about, the centuries between the 11th and the 13th had been indeed some of the most prosper. Let's put it in this way. I can say the happiest. Like it was of European history, we can say. I can say the happiest because it's true that there is a more positive approach towards the world. There is, from the early medieval times, this impression that there is a benevolent deity that is providing mankind now in this phase with more wealth, with more means, right? It's always a very tough world. The 11th, 13th century aren't easy centuries. They were pretty tough, right? And what we measure in them in a positive way is effectively the expansion, the growth as such. This, from one side, you have to think, of course, in a pre-industrial society, the population is essential in the picture. Like you can't think of a pre-industrial society expanding without an actual growth of the same, right? You can find certain very specific contexts or very favored communities that live either in over a trade route, etc. And that this did exist. Think about in Sogdian and these places that had an incredibly high level of urbanization, but at the same time we're surrounded by fairly still wild and in that case nomadic areas, right? But the general system, however, is based still on agriculture, and in order to make agriculture work, you need peasants, you need working force, and therefore the demographic expansion most of the times is measurable pre-industrial times through this the demographic increase, right? But this was a great change in other ways. This increase was also in the autonomy of certain, of the political autonomy of certain communities, for example, that managed to emerge from this net of the seigneurial system to essentially create institutions on their own, to be fundamentally autonomous and pretty active. We're talking not just about city-states, which is the most obvious example, but even peasant communities that sometimes even turned into towns, right? That had their own, and eventually began to oppress the surrounding countryside. It did start like this, and this was possible in these centuries in a way that objectively I can't think of, historically speaking, because I can't. I'm sure there were in other places of the world, but I am not 100% sure. But entire areas of the European continent passing from some of the most underdeveloped in the world into some of the richest, right? This could happen only in the Middle Ages, and it's pretty impressive that, of course, Europe was favored, environmentally speaking, by certain resources, etc. But we're talking here about actual human effort to produce that, right? It wasn't an easy expansion. Between the 11th and 13th century, for example, wars, epidemics increased at the same time, right? Major, let's say, failures of the system along the way that had already happened, right? Albeit not altering, reverting the trend fundamentally had occurred. This was a time of ferocious competition, of sufferings, of distractions. Like we rarely get used to this thing. It's always thinking of what it could be the world. Like when we tell history, we usually exclude war out of the equation. Like it's as if war hit humanity just where terribly, just I don't know, during the two world wars or in other specific contexts. No, these were worlds that were constantly exposed to war for whichever reason, because that also was a way to make things work, believe it or not. But definitely also did consume a lot of resources, right? And at the same time, the more war there is, and technically, I can say the better it is, but it obviously shows vitality. Think about, we had never made this comparison, but think about how tough was, however, and renowningly to assemble an army in early medieval Europe, right? And what it was like, fielding an army in the 13th century, right? The dramatic change. The Middle Ages really saw an incredible variety of things. The Middle Ages never existed, of course, but also they displayed this incredible variation for pre-industrial standards of standards of living, of achievements, of discoveries. Like it's really an important millennium that must be understood, however, also as a moment of growth, essentially, as a moment where whichever the basis of this potential were, that they were able to produce an incredible amount of resources, right, in every field of human application. So even within the general harshness of the life of the time, it was exactly during these centuries that the population of the continent knew this substantial increase. We think realistically that mortality also regressed, right? New cities were founded, or its city walls were fundamentally expanded. New rings actually were built. That was the usual thing. The traffics especially knew an incredible quantitative and qualitative development, right? Especially from a commercial point of view, the Middle Ages achieved what had never been seen by humanity. This is extremely meaningful. And today, as we were saying, we tend to consider, in fact, this general process as a positive and progressive one, right? And to attribute it generally to the idea that such a massive change had essentially been triggered by some sort of environmental reason, hence the climate, right? So in favor of this hypothesis, we indeed know that, for example, during the second half of the 10th century, that is also another dramatically underestimated century, especially compared to the 11th, the polar ices began to melt, and this probably also rendered possible the Viking explorations through Iceland, Greenland, and Northern America. Why did no one apparently get there before, right? Or even if they went in ancient times, they surely didn't remain, as instead would have started to happen from the Middle Ages. Also, the line of cultivation of the wine grape advanced far more north than London, where it had usually remained for centuries, which essentially shows a general mildening of the climate, right? These changes were unperceived, like the sources of the time couldn't realize that. The memory of these people was very short, generationally speaking. Like these people, normally a person in the Middle Ages would knew, of course, their parents, their grandparents, and not much more than beyond their great grandparents. Like there wasn't this great need even of keeping track of this memory. It was a very simple work, especially among the lower strata of the population. This is particularly evident, right? There was no idea that aside from the seasonal cycles, of the year that were essentially tied also to agricultural work. There was much else. This was mindset that Europeans brought from millennia. There wasn't objectively anything that could justify a different view of the world. It was still kind of cyclical, right? Christianity had introduced this idea of linear time, right? There is a beginning with the creation and the end with the judgment day, the second coming of Christ, and that's it. But this was the mentality kind of who was enough educated to even know how to read the Bible, for example, and to study it. But for an average peasant, life was the universe had always gone on cyclically, and this was keeping to go on cyclically. So things always repeat. You don't need to go back in time with your memory, because essentially there is always a new cycle repeating, and that's what you should really be concerned about. So it's obvious that this climate changes didn't affect like what the change mean. A coldening of the climate, milding of the climate in this instance is that on average harvests were more successful, right? But how often, how perceptibly this was actually, and we know, as a matter of fact, I don't know where I read this, I don't know how it was ever calculated, but generally speaking, it makes pretty much sense that a peasant, an average medieval peasant, which doesn't mean anything, but that's the approximation, at the end of his life of work would have essentially just a 4% more in wealth than what he owned at the beginning, right? So essentially you spend a lifetime without even sensing that there is a difference between what you were, where you were born, and when you died, right? So and think about all the other terrible things that happened. I mean, think about child mortality, think about earth mortality, epidemics, massacres, other catastrophes, and what are you thinking about in that world to account to register? And that's why we don't know largely what this thing was. The best sources we have in this regard are chronicles, as a matter of fact, because those were conceived most of the time analytically speaking, so you could make a comparison all in a row of what those years had been, more or less. But even the information varies wildly in reliability, depending, of course, the more distant the episode was, the year was, and the less you know, even in there, from that particular author, that instead writes much more about his own time. So aside from this, we realize from a series of hints. Now we can't discuss comprehensively, but it's really a bit about everything, every single type of source that you interrogate in this regard, that probably there was really a milding of the climate. There were scarce and regular rains, and also warm springs, which favored the achievement of good harvests. So the fact that the 14th century demographic crisis was manifested through hunger, rather before the plague, right, in the mid 14th century, has brought the majority of scholars to think that the first cause of this century's crisis was an unfavorable relation between the increase of the population and the one of production. This is also debatable, right? We of course know that this could be the case, but we don't know whether they mismanaged, or because effectively there was a worsening of the climate, or other systemic factors, or maybe even just political factors at this point, that caused this possibly. And the massive demographic increase of the previous centuries had been rendered possible essentially through the extension of the cultivated areas, right? But for example, towards the end of the 13th century, it seems that great part of the available surfaces had already been plowed, right? And that the production therefore ceased to augment. This is also just an hypothesis, right? Are we really sure about this? Like, it's obvious that there are certain areas that were saturated in part, but couldn't then there be further improvements in some ways? So technological potential was low, okay, but the possibilities of expansion probably were there. That I try to look especially at how intensively these systems were also squeezed. Like that seems to me also an interesting aspect of the story. Like these systems had gotten more powerful in general, which means that they were trying essentially to even to battle against one another, not for much for hunger in that regard, but essentially for becoming hegemonic in some ways. And this does destroy, this does consume. So we don't really know if it's difficult to tell if Europe had been just a large pacified empire, for example, what would have been of this? Would have been a crisis like this, or maybe not? We could compare this with China, for example. But as far as for Europe, it's very complicated, and the general impression, at least I have, is that Europeans did really contribute heavily to this crisis by essentially squeezing the system till the very drop at one point, so that it didn't just fail because they actively destroyed something, but because they exhausted in part the potential that could be available at that point, because certain damages at the time, also through conflicts, cannot really be restructured so easily, right? You can't become, for example, a more powerful political and military entity without increasing taxes, becoming always more imposing on the others, and you have to vent these expenses very often on other people's land. You got better organized as in first place. Also, that can mean that you're more effective against an enemy, but this enemy goes destroyed. So, for example, the 14th century, paradoxically, is also a moment of territorial compaction, which is often overlooked, because we say, well, the 13th century moments of crisis, fragmentation, shrinking of certain universal powers. Yes, but if you see what was happening from a local level in terms of consolidation of territorial domains and their expansion, you see that there was a rationalization, was a structuration, and it did cost. Because this, from one side it granted more stability, also in conditions of progressed crisis apparently, but at the same time it also required a structure that needed to be maintained by the rest of the population. So it's very interesting, and that's why I was talking about before the establishment of the Ancien Regime as we know it, probably in the 14th century, have been catalyzed, or at least being definitely consolidated as a premise, right? At least that would more evenly develop in the following centuries. But this system also evolved on the base of a request for more stability, right? And the request for more stability doesn't come just through, there's economical contraction, because usually economical contractions also bring to a need of, simply that there are no resources anymore, and that naturally someone can exploit the situation if they're more advantaged. So this doesn't end actually wars and fights. This continue, right? But at the same time, these need, once again, a kind of more firm control in the population, and the population needs that as well, because they're effectively sane people, right? There is not the evil guy at the top that wants to make everybody poor. In the ferocious competition expansion of the 11th, 13th century, it was there were some of the most cruel and violent things you can ever imagine, but generally speaking, who was at the top wanted to rule, but wanted to rule on a flourishing society, right? So when you see this compaction at the bottom of society, you realize that probably there is something consensual about it, and also in terms of political centralization. The fact that you need one chief, also because things are getting rougher, exactly, also from a military point of view, and division doesn't work pretty well in that regard. So it's a series of complex factors that are not also in here, that they're difficult to catch clearly individually, but they give you an impression what were happening in this specific point. And in a sense, production is not just destroyed, because what happened, especially with the great failures of the Italian banking at the beginning of the 14th century, is that lots of investors came back to the land asset, right, which was way more valid, and we realized that maybe the trade traffic was contracted, etc., but there was a reinvestment in simply different things too, right? So probably less circulated at one point. We know the population shrank, in part where entire areas where the forests and swamps came back. We know all these things, but it's difficult to give a generalizing picture, and from single varying details. But when we look at from a broader scale, you realize that here the medieval civilization was actually compacting towards something, in fact, more modern looking, right? It's also difficult to talk about the pre-existing mindset. It was kind of probably more optimistic, but it was also probably more disorderly in many ways. Also, we have this idea that in the 13th century everything was framed, so before the crisis, in the triumph of the universalism and a feudal system. But even if you look at that picture, well, wasn't quite like that, right? From the mid 13th century, universalism was already in crisis by itself. There were other mentalities expanding. There was a very different situation, and it was perhaps a more fatalistic world, and this doesn't speak much for the structuration of the same. That's why you really experience the crisis in the following centuries, probably, right? The crisis of the 14th century does bring a substantial quota of rationale, in my opinion, in European civilization from before. Not that it didn't exist before, but that crisis brings people to reason more forcefully. And that's where innovation also comes from. So, once again, very difficult to look at this. And some say, however, that population, in spite of this apparent exhaustion of available resources, was keeping to grow, right? This is also debatable. I mean, it's possible. It depends when and where you start counting this, actually. But it's obvious that you don't even need to keep growing exactly to exasperate the system. I mean, you can simply, if it was structure failure, well, at that point you may have already slowed down demographically speaking, and crumbling the same because of a lack of a base at that point. So in many ways we don't know how it happened, but we see that, for example, nutrition decayed, right? There was a drastic drop in the amount and quality of food that was eaten. There was also political and social reason for this, right? A lot of people had come working in areas where they started depending by people who, in that sense, were accumulating under in their possession a greater amount of wealth, right? And we are talking about very wealthy people, even commoners that had become so powerful even more and easily sometimes than nobles or even than kings themselves. So this was an important problem, because usually the activities under which these people were framed had increased the competition too. I mean, the labor had become cheaper, and therefore who went to work in there was usually without much of a hope. It didn't have kind of a support at their side, right? This was in part, we're talking especially about cities, right? A lot of peasants abandoning the countryside, where they were also partly oppressed, because in the 13th century feudalism had substantially expanded further. So the conditions also in the countryside, personal freedom, hadn't been terrifically better. Yes, some communities had made it, but some hadn't. And generally, even if there are, I don't know, even maybe peasant communities to make it to obtain some status, some power, well, there is still someone that doesn't benefit from this, often from the lower strata. So lots of people, and that's the reason why medieval cities grew so rapidly, and they were also dramatically more crowded and less hygienic than, for example, Roman cities that probably didn't actually have, as the Vulgata says, this dramatic hygiene, right? Not even because there were aqueducts and things like that. It was a different thing. It must be compared contextually. Began simply to go work as salaried workers, not as free, like, kind of rural gentry that had some money and went to the city to search fortune and improve their status. This happened in part as well, but it was rare, and generally speaking, at this point, there's a lot of social stratification. So either you go up or you go under. The majority of people go under, and they basically depend on their work. So this causes major crisis, because you understand when there is decline, an economical decline, or even a recession, at that point, the first heads who roll are exactly the ones of salaried workers, because the system was still about the countryside. These activities were somewhat accessory, right? So it's textiles, we know kept being produced, were also quite expensive, etc. But they were becoming always more kind of a luxury product. And that means also that there is an elite that becomes overwhelmingly more powerful, and therefore the others are essentially sinking in this picture. So lots of these people were losing even the ability of feeding themselves decently, right? Salaries were maintained low, exactly because of the increase of the offer of labor force, tied to this previous demographic increase, but also, as we have seen, other political and social reasons. And so you have to think of this denourished population that already in normal conditions was destined to succumb to the next prolonged increase in prices. And this actually happened very often at the time. All the prices were fundamentally regulated on this the harvest, right? If in spring, late spring, this thing, or even in summer, if in summer there was hail destroying, the grain, etc., it was a massive problem, right? And therefore, everything was also stocks like food was running out at one point, right? These systems didn't produce an enormous amount of surplus. They had it; they could buy it from other places. By the way, this is what usually, in fact, wealthiest communities did in this time of crisis, but naturally at a cost that was reversed on society. But it could easily happen in condition of famines or a harvest went ruined, and this caused an increase of price. And this was kind of normal in the Middle Ages every once in a while. It's not even just it was not particularly systemic like the Malthusian cycle, especially even at the modern age, but this still was essentially the same, like at a local level. It could be that the average salaried worker would go to sleep every once in a while still hungry, right? But you could compensate that, and this kind of eroded your health progressively. But considering what was the quality of life at the time, it was not even the worst thing that could happen to you. The problem is that when these harvests begin to fail ever more often, right? And this is especially evident with the harvests of the years 1315 and 1317, the Great Famine of 1315, 1317, that caused in many areas of Europe a massive disruption, in fact, of these production systems, right? And this is a big problem because it's not just a matter of waiting for next year. Some can't, so they have to go live away in another place, or there are, as we've seen before, communities that must buy grain from somewhere else, and then sell it at political prices once again. But there is a huge competition in the ways that worked as well, and that shifted capitals also from from certain centers to others. So this changed a lot of things complexively in the system. But keeping to watch at the average peasant and or urban worker of the late 13th century, for example, well, this was, physically speaking, the result of several generations that had been nourished almost exclusively with cereals, right? And which means that they lacked, quite seriously, fat and proteins, right? That, as a consequence, couldn't give these people particular physiological defense, right, against illnesses, etc. So the precarity of this balance that was already present there, it had always existed in part, but that the last generations especially had been fairly used to think it would be, it was still framed in a moment of growth, right? Especially in the first 2 decades of the 14th century, collapsed, and this seems to have occurred also in part because of climate change. It seems that was this new phase of coldening and or at least of general worsening of the climate. The ice cap basically began to expand once again, and there were long years characterized by rains and humidity that followed one another in Europe, causing therefore not just the the ravaging of illnesses by coldening, but they also, which hit chiefly children under the 5 years old and old people, but also a series of bad agricultural harvests with the consequent famines and levitation of prices, right? So you can't reabsorb this easily, especially in a system that in the last generations has structured itself to work with those standards thanks to resources that were normally available at that point. So this is a big crack, right? Cold and humidity brought illnesses and hunger, and all of these things determined also a socio-economical destabilization, particularly among the lower classes that were already in this condition of general weakness. So the general European, let's say, the general trend of the phenomenon wasn't very clear there, right? They didn't know what would happen next. We do now, right? We are advantaged because we know how it's gone. They didn't, but they did realize that this was going on. They recorded that there were unusual changes in their societies, that even the climate was bad. Like, usually you find these things like nobody remembers like a winter was so cold, or a summer that was so rainy, or maybe a winter that was so hot. Like, there were certain things that impressed these people a lot, and that tells you that it hadn't been so before, or at least that in that measure there was some damage of sort, and that for that society was important, right? Because also people today have debate quite desperately about this thing. Hot weather also existed before. It didn't. That's not important. Aside from whether we know effectively that there's been a warming of climate, then the causes are also debatable, but the general point here is that there is a recognition that something has changed. So maybe it was, I don't know, it's difficult to claim, like, if an author writes, I don't know, it's snow remained up to April in a place like Italy or southern France, etc., which is not normal, right? That's something you have to take into account, because maybe that person has invented it, but maybe other chroniclers say similar things, right? So it's just one mention. But even if it hadn't been true, the fact that there was this general perception that things were going worse is is meaningful. And another problem we have is that historiography evolved over this time. Like, it's not that by the 13th century you have all this great amount of information like you have in the 14th. So maybe people in the 13th century thought the same, who knows, but in fact, we know the one in 14th did, right? And on base of these evidence, sometimes we get certain mismatch, like maybe we get fooled by these sources in some ways. We actually fool ourselves in thinking that that's actually what really happened, right? So, but there is a consolidated agreement, however, that especially in certain years there was something that was going seriously bad, especially when the source is, for example, is a merchant who traveled all across Europe and knew about what the markets were in other places. You know, if a merchant says, "Oh, this happened," maybe tells you here locally this happened, it was bad, but this also happened all over Europe. Point. Well, you don't know at that point. Of course, you should check the other European regions, but the important is that the person wrote that, maybe didn't write it on other occasions. So those are the indicators that you usually have in the absence of other evidence, right? So there is this great drama that is perceived, this great phenomenon that seemed to have changed, and this was the first symptom of the difficulties that threatened Europe, like in the famine of 1315 and 1317. With this several years in which the harvests were particularly bad, that made prices levitate, first necessity goods, right? And therefore the less protected classes in the population were incapable of coping with this, and this continued in every pre-industrial situation, right? And this also, it's easy to prove. I mean, famines had always been there, even in the 13th century, even at the peak of the expansion, right? But they had a local character. And the development reached by the trade nets, commercial nets, had allowed the authorities, especially the city ones, to reduce the effects by importing grain for those regions that had not been hit by bad harvests. So they maintained within certain acceptable limits the increase of prices and the consequent mortality, right? By the 13th, in 1315 and 1317, this was not possible anymore. Right, this was a big thing because it was characterized for the width at the moment, except for the regions that were maybe spared by chance, by the caprice of climate. It was really the majority of Europe instead that at this point found itself in difficulty. So this was a random, if you want, succession of negative climatic conditions, cold and long winters, and excessively rainy summers, usually, that were accompanied with this massive hailstorms that damaged harvests in such a way to cause a crisis that for gravity, duration, and extension, right, was unknown, right, unprecedented in as far as people could recall at the time with their memory limits, historically speaking. So the cereal prices began to increase enormously. They provoked the death of many people, but also of a lot of cattle, a lot of livestock, for the effects of poor nutrition, right, and of illnesses that these changes brought with themselves. For example, in the city of Ypres, that counted between 25,000 inhabitants, we're talking about the death in 6 months between May and November 1316 of almost 3,000 people, which means more than one inhabitant over 10, right? this is a lot, and consider that Ypres, together with other regions in Flanders, other cities in Flanders, was essentially one of the richest centers in Europe. Exactly, those centers were the let's say the concentration of people maintained by essentially trade and commercial activities was present. So don't underestimate in this sense that this was the heart of Europe in part, economically speaking. So if the crisis hit there that hard, you can imagine how structural, if anything, this collapse was, because normally these people were the best suited to get better, right, given the amount of wealth, etc. Obviously, every city had a different story, but Ypres is a good example of a very prosperous place that here suffers a major blow. Then there was another major wave of famine that ran through Europe during the course of the 5th decade of the century. So even after actually or during the Black Death. So this brought to a major process of destructuration, right? That especially was intense, like it lasted a long time. That was, however, only in the 40s that of the 14th century that saw this major concentration and that let's say hit this already destabilized system at a point that where a crack, a major blow was more evident to trace, right? So these peaks of, especially with Black Death, that destabilized the system was were the result of a much broader phenomenon. In fact, even within the cities, as we've seen, the first signs of the crisis emerged very, very early, right? Especially through the form of stagnation in production and in the distribution of certain products, especially the textile ones that were essentially the ones of luxury, or at least of non-first necessity goods in most of the times, and also in the consequent style of the relation between the golden money, right, that was the instrument in fact of international traffics, and the one of silver or kind of less precious metal that constituted the ordinary material for the salaried pay. So in 1320 circa, this relation had gone qualifying itself towards a constant growth of the value of gold, which is actually a good sign of for substantial wealth of international traffics. Well, it's instead between the 20s and the 40s that this tendency inverted itself, and it caused substantial damage, right? First of all, a series of great loans, very large ones, granted by the Florentine banks. We're talking about the families of the Acciaioli, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, etc., to these European sovereigns, and that were never restituted, right? It prosecuted this chain of banking failures that were in turn destined to create major destabilization for the small and medium mercantile business, that to those banks they had entrusted their capitals. So this was a chain of failures of selling of mobile goods, right? The concentration of riches and of general impoverishment, right? So that's how it goes normally in this moment. So this actually favored a lot even social stratification, right? But it's one of the factors, not all of them. It wasn't just due to the effect of impoverishment of all the the system, but it definitely had played a part, and it had consolidated the trend. And it's a consequence of a economic financial stagnation that was deeply connected to the general crisis. Just the other day we made, well, time runs here, we made a few years ago, few days ago, this video consolidation of European financial companies between the 14th and the 15th century that deals in part with this. I mean, it's a starting point for continuing what we're telling now about the development of these banks after the crisis, right? So that can be useful. And yeah, okay, that's pretty much it. There would be a lot to add because, I think it's difficult to give an orderly explanation to all of these things happening. Like, where do you start from, right? If I had to choose, for example, I would start from war, because I studied that exactly in this period, and I have my own opinion about the fact that this thing costed a freaking lot, but then I don't know personally the expertise to understand how much that impacted. I still have to figure out, at least in part, comparing with other studies at least, how this fundamentally worked. Like, what was the cause and what was the consequence? This is very important. It's not easy to answer this, and that's why there is always such a great debate between among historians about these topics, because they fundamentally there are questions that fundamentally can't be answered, right? It's usual to say, okay, well, it was more from this side or a story more on the other, like, because every specialist, every expert can tell you, look, this is what effectively happened from this regard, and you say, oh, it's all about this factor, right? Then you hear another expert and you've concentrated on another one, and even if you were able to, like, attribute more or less concreteness, let's say, to, like, you can objectively see that there are things that are more or less important than others, but you may also wonder what were the relations existing between these factors. Do we really know that? We don't. In certain cases we do, but they're usually very confined in time and space. So unfortunately there are certain questions that it's good to keep discussing, right, and trying to answer, but that can't really be answered ultimately, right? Definitively. So this is always a problem for historians, but it's also an invitation to say, okay, study what you can and come up with substantial evidence, but don't think you can answer the whole picture, right? This is very important. So I would stop here. I don't know how this video turned out, because frankly I don't care anymore. Like, I just start talking, then it goes by itself. But I think it's fascinating to reflect, at least by aside from all of these different problems, how the change did occur, right? And that Europe between the 13th and the 15th century, well, changed an enormous lot. You can't even recognize it anymore. And these were brusque changes, right, for those structures. I mean, it took time, but always contextualize it in the overall fragility or delicacy, or wherever you want to put it, of the systems at the time. So you don't have you can change a system relatively easy in this sense, easily, but it's also meaningful that things can't really change so much at that point in the same way. So it's all very thought-provoking, and we will discuss this on other occasions, right? But just bear in mind its importance as a general phenomenon that basically in the Middle Ages that does never have. Like, this is the single, probably the single most important crisis that occurred. Even the Carolingian Empire, I didn't think it was effectively a matter of like, even the transformation that that occurred later on were kind of possibly more important. I don't know. I can't answer this question frankly, but at the same time, I realized that there was a let's say a longer change, right? This triggered probably a change that, I mean, the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, the second invasions, etc. That was very, very important. It really hit at the roots of the same system. But at the same time, it also wasn't so brusque, and it didn't change so much in such a short term. Well, the 14th century crisis did, right? Even if for our standards today it's not an enormous deal, apparently, well, actually it was at the time, and it is still for us. It is in the measure it still shaped the world for a long time how we know it, right? And it sets the trend of certain changes that would keep like this. However, I stop here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.